thanks for the introduction and for inviting me to speak. I think the afternoon's got a really nice flow in terms of the case studies. So we've heard a lot about really impressive efforts to set up international registries, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the UK Cystic Fibrosis Registry and hopefully tantalise you somewhat with all of the things you can do once you've got over that hump of setting up a registry and you actually have something up and running. To start off, I'll quickly explain what cystic fibrosis is, in case you're not aware. It's a genetic condition. 1 in 25 people in the UK are carriers of the gene for cystic fibrosis. And we have about 10,000 people with cystic fibrosis in the UK, which compared to a lot of the conditions you guys are here to represent isn't that rare. It's a condition predominantly of the respiratory and digestive system, whereby the organs get clogged up with sticky mucus that can make you very prone to lung infections in particular. It's a lifelong and life-shortening condition where, although there's been huge advances over the last 50 years, and we've seen median predicted survival go from 5 years old to 45, that still unfortunately means that half of people with cystic fibrosis are not expected to reach the age of 45, and for those people that do pass away, the average age that people with CF die is just 28, so we've still got a long way to go. So I'm going to give you a very short introduction to what the UK CF Registry is, and we've had some really good talks already explaining what registries are and what their purpose is, so I won't dwell too much on that. And I'll move on to what we do with our registry now that we have one that's up and running. So I'll talk a little bit about our public reporting, phase 4 trials or pharmacovigilance, which Chris mentioned earlier, data request, which is a fairly broad topic, but I'll give some specific examples, and then I'll talk about what we're doing next in terms of enhancing our technology to take our registry to a new phase. So a very short introduction. So we've been collecting data in the UK CF Registry since 1996. We have ethical approval and informed consent from everyone with cystic fibrosis whose data we hold in the registry. It's been sponsored and managed by the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, which is a patient organisation, since 2007. We have over 10,000 people with cystic fibrosis on the registry. About 10,000 of those have complete data sets every year. And we cover about 99% of the population, which really shows how lucky we are in cystic fibrosis, and I believe in rare disease generally, in terms of the level of engagement in research that we have from our patient community, but also the amount of support we get from our clinical teams, who are the ones that actually sit with the families after a new diagnosis, explain to them what the registry is, why it's valuable, give them a general introduction into research, and get the consent of so many people. So I'm going to move on now to talk about what we do with the registry, and first of all that will focus on public reporting, which is the main public-facing output that we have for the registry, and it's one of the ways that we demonstrate to people with cystic fibrosis what we're doing with their data and how we're using it to improve clinical outcomes for them and their families. The annual data report is the main way that we do this. We published our data report on 2015 data last month in August. We were the first cystic fibrosis registry in the world to publish our 2015 data, which is something we're pretty chuffed about. And this is just an overview of what we do in terms of publications. So we have a detailed version and an at-a-glance version of our report, both of which are aimed to be accessible to everybody. So we don't have, as we used to several years ago, a scientific version aimed for the clinical teams, and then a summary version aimed at people with cystic fibrosis. When we've gone out to our community to ask them what they want, they've said absolutely everything. So we take it upon ourselves to try and give as much detail from the registry as we possibly can into the public domain, and do our best to make it understandable to people with cystic fibrosis. It's an iterative process, we don't get it right every time. Trying to explain pretty complex bugs that you can pick up in cystic fibrosis, and also the genetic element of CF can be really difficult to do in plain English, but we try our best. And we have to remind sometimes the clinical community that they can understand plain English as well, so it doesn't have to be jargon. And then we promote our report as much as we possibly can, so that people with CF and their families are aware that this is a resource for them to use. We do that with social media infographics, so they go out on all the usual platforms: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We have a press release that goes out to usually more the healthcare journals and the healthcare publications, a news story on our website, and we also have printed copies available on request. Most people tend to access a news report in PDF, but you get some people who like to be able to scribble all over it like me, so we do have some printed copies available. And this is just an example from the first few hours of when we put our report online. It is something that the community do really care about. They do like to read these reports and access them. So you can see that in the first couple of hours we've had 317 shares, over 700 likes. My biggest supporter right here, that's my mum, so always rely on her. And we had 33 comments, so that just shows the level of engagement and buy-in you can get with the patient registry once they're up and running. So I'm going to go through some of the headline stats that we have in our annual report. Now, whilst I appreciate that cystic fibrosis isn't the area of focus for a lot of you, what I hope this demonstrates is the power that data can have and how rich an information resource a registry can be. So as I said, for 2015 we've got well over 10,000 people registered, and that actually represents an increase of over 1,000 people since 2011. Now this is something that's really hard hitting when you're talking to commissioners and policymakers in terms of creating provision for CF care in future. It's really powerful to be able to demonstrate the upward trend in terms of the population over time. It's a really good problem to have because it's symptomatic of the fact that people are living longer, but it's something that we need to be able to provide for intensive care. As I said, we have 89% of people with complete data year on year, and one of the reasons for that is that our NHS healthcare providers rely on our registry for their commissioning payments, which I'll talk about later, which is a really good carrot to get good quality data in. The median age of people with cystic fibrosis on the registry is 19, which shows that, as I said, although we're getting higher and higher survival in cystic fibrosis, we've still got a pretty young median age in terms of the population. And very nearly 60% of our population are now 16 or over, which is how we class adults. And this again is a way of demonstrating how much a registry can show the evolving needs of a patient population. So as well as having more and more people with cystic fibrosis, unlike even 15 years ago, we've got a vast majority more people who are falling into the adult care group, which means that we need more adult care provision than we did only a few short years ago. So 50% of our patients are cared for in adult centres now. What this amounts to in terms of the increase in the adult population and the increase in the population overall is that technically we have an increase in approximately the size of one adult cystic fibrosis centre every year. So whilst we could try banging on the table and asking for a new CF centre every year, it's probably not going to work, and a registry is a really good way to start to get people thinking about innovative ways to provide care for this changing population. Diagnosis, we introduced newborn screening that included cystic fibrosis nationally in 2007, and a lot of that was down to the work of the Cystic Fibrosis Trust and the registry that we held. And it's really good news that you can really see the change over time in the median age of diagnosis. It's just 2 months now. And the earlier you diagnose someone with cystic fibrosis, the sooner you can intervene, the sooner you can introduce treatments over time to families that otherwise would be getting a lot of treatments all at once if they have a later diagnosis. And actually for people with cystic fibrosis aged under 16 in 2015, the median age of diagnosis was just 26 days. And so that's just showing those improvements over time and the impact of investment by the NHS into things like newborn screening. Other ways that we tie in the work of the registry with other initiatives by the Cystic Fibrosis Trust and the way that you see the registry powering the other work that we do as a charity is around genotypes. And we've recently been running a Genotype Matters campaign to try and educate people with cystic fibrosis, families and clinical teams of the importance of people with cystic fibrosis knowing their own genotype. It's something that's increasingly important because in cystic fibrosis as well as in other areas, we're getting more and more medications that are targeted specifically at the patient's genotype. So some patients are eligible for some therapies, some aren't, and these genotype-specific therapies, rather than minimising the symptoms of cystic fibrosis, they actually start to treat the underlying cause of the problem, so that you're getting people who aren't exhibiting those symptoms as much in the first place. So these are real life-changing therapies. They're orphan drugs, so they're very expensive. So it's really important that we have a good, complete understanding in our registry about how many people are going to be eligible for these new drugs when it comes to having conversations with commissioners about reimbursement. So as a result of this Genotype Matters campaign, we've now got 98% of everyone registered on the registry has a complete genotype of both alleles. So that's a really, really powerful information resource, and the commissioners come to us all the time to ask how many people have F508del in Scotland, how many people have G551D in Scotland, and that's really powerful information that we can use. just to show how we publish these information, so because we get these queries again and again, partly so I can just put it out there and not have to answer these requests all the time, we publish in our annual report now genotypes by devolved nation. And you can see that we suppress numbers of less than 5, which was mentioned earlier in terms of data protection standards. But it means that people with CF, commissioners, healthcare teams get a really good idea of the spread of genotypes, and you can actually see that even just in the UK, you've got real differences in the prevalence of different genotypes. So for R1178, which is the 4th row down, which is one of those genotypes that these targeted therapies are now available for, you've got a difference between 7% in Scotland to just 3% in Wales in terms of prevalence. So there are big differences. It's very important to not generalise, and when you've got a patient level registry, you don't have to generalise. And in terms of our at-a-glance report, we publish this sort of map preview, which is just an example of how we try and publish our data in lots of different ways, because some people like tables, some people like graphs, some people like infographics. So rather than picking on their behalf and only doing one, we try and do everything, which my graphic designer really loves. Survival is always the thing that people tend to flip straight to when the public report comes out, for better or worse. So this is just a demonstration of our survival statistics and the way we publish lots of different statistics on survival to try and give a complete picture. So we had 125 deaths in cystic fibrosis in 2015, and you can see the age of those deaths. So although we're getting less and less deaths of a proportion of the population, and generally predicted survival is older and older, you can really see a peak around the 24 to 27 age group, which is a real danger zone for cystic fibrosis. And to be honest, we still don't 100% understand why that is, and it's much more of a danger for women than it is for men with cystic fibrosis. So it's really important that you can very clearly home in on where the problem area is and focus your research there. I mentioned the median age of death being just 28, which we can probably all agree is far too young. Another example, so this is another infographic from our at-a-glance report, and it's less good news. A lot of what we're able to publish, fortunately, is good news about upward trends or seeing a reduction in the amount of infections that we're getting. With Transplant in the UK, it's less of a good news story, particularly when you compare to Europe. So we have a lot lower proportion of people with CF living with a transplant in the UK than you get in Europe. So it's 5% in Europe and 3% in the UK. So there's a problem with transplant in the UK. And it's just to show you the impact of what that can have when you publish these kind of data online. We did get quite a lot of reaction on social media from this particular one, and this is just one example from a guy called Chris who has CF. He said, despite I'd gone back to him to try and reassure him a little bit about the exploratory work we were doing off the back of this, these findings, and he said it's still scary statistics. Oh, it makes me worry just thinking of it. But it's really important to be open with our patient population about these problems so that they can really get behind us and back our work when we're trying to solve them. Other public reporting that we do that is separate to the sort of static annual report is we have an interactive population map, which we're able to publish because we do collect postcode data in our registry. So this is generated from just the first half of postcodes so that it's anonymised data, and you can basically click on your county and see how many people with cystic fibrosis are in your county, the spread of male versus female, and the spread of under 16 versus over 16. We do get quite a lot of questions about who lives where with cystic fibrosis. Sometimes it's because fundraising groups just really want to know how many people are going to be affected by funding initiatives in their area. Whenever we're trying to get press attention for anything that we're doing, it's really valuable for regional newspapers to be able to give them a regional statistic as well as a national one. So if we're getting coverage and raising awareness of the condition, having those regional statistics is really vital. But also I think sometimes people just like to click around on the map. So I'm going to talk now about phase 4 trials or pharmacovigilance studies. They're called lots of different things. They can also be called post-marketing surveillance studies, which is good fun. So phase 4 studies are all about monitoring the safety and effectiveness of new therapies, as Chris explained earlier. So we have 3 of these pharmacovigilance studies running using the registry right now, and we've got 3 more due to come online in 2017. There's a load of good reasons for running pharmacovigilance studies. One of them is that our community tells us that they are really keen for us to use our registry to help develop new treatments and monitor new treatments when we went out to them. We got well over 1,000 responses to a survey that was specific to the registry, which again shows that people are prepared to take the time and effort to fill in a survey about the registry and that they're interested in it. So in terms of pharmacovigilance, there's lots of different advantages. One is that you're not having a pharmaceutical company going up and setting up a separate, potentially competing registry in terms of time and resources that only monitors those people with cystic fibrosis who are on their therapy. The fantastic thing about using a registry for these kind of studies is that you have the whole population to compare those people who are on drug with. So if you have someone taking a new therapy and maybe you get in that group a prevalence of 1% who are coughing up blood, you can get a really good idea straight away of whether that looks like it might be something that's associated with taking that therapy, or whether that's just part and parcel of having cystic fibrosis and being that age and genotype. So you're less likely to scare the European Medicines Agency when you send them the report, when you can show them that actually this is normal for CF, or you can actually say, no, this isn't normal and something needs to be done about it. Also, having these run by a patient organisation is really fantastic in terms of buy-in from our patient community, because we're seen as a charity, as a trusted third party when generating these reports. So having a really good collaborative relationship with the pharma companies I work with, I know this would never happen, but it's really reassuring for patients for me to be able to go out and say, these reports are written collaboratively with a patient organisation. There's no chance that a pharmaceutical company can downplay a negative outcome or overplay a positive outcome. Every single line of every report is agreed upon by equivalents in the charity and in the pharmaceutical company. It also brings great investment in the registry. So because of these pharmacovigilance studies, our registry is completely self-sustaining financially, and actually 60% of the income that we get from pharmacovigilance studies we're able to send straight back out to the cystic fibrosis centres to support them in the burden of entering their data. Unfortunately, it's not the kind of amount you're looking at to fund an entire post, but it might fund them going to a conference and going on a training course once a year, and every little helps, and it really does help. So data requests is something else that we do. We do obviously give out data and try and ensure that it's used to its maximum potential, because that's something else that our community say to us. If we're giving you the consent for you to enter your data and our clinical teams are spending time getting it into your system, we want to make sure that you're actually using it. So there's a few ways that we do that. So we help commissioners to provide funding to NHS centres that is proportionate. So in a lot of specialised services, commissioning arrangements are basically a bean counting exercise, and you get paid based on the number of people that you see, or maybe the number of times that you see them as a maximum. Whereas with cystic fibrosis, we use the registry data on an individual patient level to look at things like what therapies they're taking, how many IV days they have, whether they have bugs like chronic Pseudomonas, to basically weight each individual patient and put them into a band that goes between 1 and 7. And then the cystic fibrosis centres are paid on the basis of those bands. And just to give you an idea of how important the registry data is here, those bands range from £4,000 per year to over £40,000 per year. So the cystic fibrosis centres know that it's really important that their data are up to date and accurate, which is fantastic for us and for all of the other outputs that we have. But also it's great that the Cystic Fibrosis Trust is able to contribute to cystic fibrosis centres receiving payments that are at least proportionate, although unfortunately we don't have much of a say in how much money is associated with each band. We also, of course, provide data for research, so we have a data application process where research teams can apply for access to pseudonymised or anonymised versions of the data. We don't charge anything at all for centres that contribute data to the registry to get it back out again. For things like pharmaceutical requests, then we charge a small fee to cover the cost of extracting the data, but we don't charge for data, which is an important distinction to make. We also provide data to the European Cystic Fibrosis Patient Registry, which I'm on the exec committee for, which means that as well as having a national registry, we effectively have an international European registry as well, and I'm happy to take questions about that if there's more detail required. And also in terms of data requests, we also hope that we give clinical teams the information they need to monitor and improve their services. We do that in a few ways with the software that we have. They have access to a dashboard that gives them a view in real time of how they're doing versus the real time national average, and they also have individual patient charts that they can generate, and actually a lot of our clinicians pull those up when they're sat in clinic with their patient to show them their lung function over time or their BMI over time, for example. And of course clinical teams at any time can extract their own data. It's only if they want national data or data for other centres that they have to come to us as a data request. So we try and be as open as possible. We also have a facility in our registry for clinical teams to write and make their own custom fields, which we don't analyse centrally, but it means if a centre is undertaking a local research, audit or service evaluation project, they can append that onto the same piece of software that they use for the registry. So that's one of the ways that we try and encourage the clinical teams to be dipping in and out of the registry as often as possible by making it more valuable for them locally. So I'm going to move on now to talking about where we're going now and enhancing our technology. So in February this year, we migrated all of our data onto a new technology platform. So this is our old one, and this is our new shiny one. You can tell from the names these aren't real patients, I hope. So this is just from our test system, but it just gives you an idea of what the system looks like. If some of you guys are thinking about tendering for a software platform, I think it's useful to know what other people are doing. So we try and make things as simple and at a glance as possible. So this is the record management screen where you can see your patients depending on which centre you're on. Annie's our registry coordinator, by the way, who named a site after herself, modestly. You can transfer a patient. If they've moved to another site, you can electronically transfer them so the data doesn't have to be re-entered. And you've got a kind of RAG-rated view of how complete your records are. So now that we're on this new platform, which is much more agile and cheap and quick to run than our old system was, we went through a sort of pretty comprehensive tendering exercise and went with a local software company called NetSolving, who are based in Croydon, and they've been absolutely fantastic, with me being ridiculously demanding and changing my mind quite a lot. So that's great, and we're working with them now that we've got that new system in place and the foundations laid. We can now build on those foundations. So there's a few things we're working on, and one of those is registry-based clinical trials. So I'm probably preaching to the converted here. Clinical trials are increasingly expensive to run and unfeasible to get funding for. And there's a lot of, in cystic fibrosis anyway, there's a lot of fundamental questions about cystic fibrosis care that, because they're not about a pharma-funded new therapy, just aren't getting answered because our academic PIs can't get funding for a £5 million randomised clinical trial. So we're trying to find a way of running cheaper, more cost-effective clinical trials. Also, by running a clinical trial that's based in a registry, you get an investment in the system that creates a data legacy that's available then to everyone. Whereas often with clinical trials, you find that a huge amount of money, time and resources are invested in creating a clinical trial data set, and then it disappears at the end of the study, which is a real shame. So this way the data are still part of the registry even when the study ends. And you're also getting a genuine view of real-world practice rather than clinical trial practice, which is often very different because patients tend to do better just because they're in a clinical trial because they get seen more by their clinical team, for example. So it means when you're coming to getting approval from EMA or you're getting reimbursement decisions, you've got much more robust data that people like NICE are more likely to be convinced by because it represents what's going to happen in the real world when these therapies are being prescribed. So it's all about bringing new therapies faster to people with cystic fibrosis, essentially, and we have two registry-based clinical studies launching, both in November. So can you tell how sort of stressed and caffeinated I am? So they're nearly ready. One of those is called CF Start, which I'm a co-applicant on, which is looking at flucloxacillin prescription in babies with cystic fibrosis. That's a randomised clinical trial, and clinical teams will only have to enter their data once into the registry, and then they can update it in the clinical trial CRF with one click, basically. So that's exciting. And then finally, I wanted to talk quickly about my CF Registry, which is launching its pilot phase in 15 days. So this is all about giving people with cystic fibrosis a window into the registry, and it's all about trying to maintain the trust that people with CF have in us when it comes to consenting to their data being in the registry. We've got 99% of people, but we certainly don't want to rest on our laurels in terms of the trust that is demonstrating from the CF community to us. So we really want to give people with CF a sense of ownership of the registry and a much better understanding of what is the registry and what are we holding in it. So initially, the first phase of that is going to be about people with cystic fibrosis being able to enter their own quality of life and wellbeing data. And that's what's launching in October. Following on from that, we're going to give them their own version of the clinical dashboard so they can view their own trends in terms of clinical data over time whenever they want. And they'll also be able to sign up to bespoke clinical trial alerts so that we'll be able to scan the registry for those people who explicitly opt in for inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then send them tailor-made alerts to say, there's a new clinical trial available, it looks like you might be eligible, go and speak to your clinical team. So that's another thing that people with CF tell us they need, is more information about clinical trials. So that's a whistle-stop tour. Thanks very much.